Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Sunday Shot. Dave, hello.
Morning, Joe. How are we doing?
Very well. So, this is the first Sunday of the election campaign. Very exciting. We are off.
5 weeks. 5 weeks
5 weeks
left.
to go.
hmm
And the end of a budget week as well. So, we are absolutely delighted that we have two very eminent economists on the show with us today. We have independent economist Nicki Hutley.
Morning.
Welcome, Nicki. And we also have the Australia Institute's chief economist, Greg Jericho.
Hello.
Hello, welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
I just want to point out we had lots of requests for the good Greg, which I think is quite funny.
And spookily, no request at all for the bad Greg.
Not a single one, except for me. But I'm a sicko anyway.
So, Greg, Nicki, budget week has come and gone, and I think Albanese let Chalmers give his speech. Dutton stood up, and as soon as he'd finished almost, he was hightailing it off to Government House to try and ensure that as little oxygen as possible was devoted to the budget reply speech. Let's talk about the budget first of all. There were lots of measures in there that we knew were coming, Medicare, the HEX changes, PBS, but there were a few surprises as well, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit annoying for me because I'd written my column for Guardian the night before thinking I'm being very smart because I'll have plenty of time and there'll be nothing new. And then first page we open up and someone yells, tax cuts. And I'm like, what? I was like, oh, great. Now I actually have to rewrite my column, which was most enjoyable. But yeah, I mean, basically that was it. I mean, it was an incredibly small budget, really. I mean, one of the easy ways to look at it is look at budget paper number 2, which has all the new expenditures, all the new revenue measures. And it was 80 pages long. Normally it's about 200 pages. Back in the Rudd days, it used to be a bit over 300 pages. It was a real, oh God, we have to deliver a budget. We weren't planning to. Let's put in the tax cuts. And geez, have you got any other measures that we had that we were going to put in the last week of the costings? And let's throw it in. Looks like a budget. And let's get out and get on with it.
So let's get this out of the way quickly. If I'm the hypothetical type of person that would love to see the billionaires squeezed with massive taxes and a reasonable price put on our natural resources, did I get this budget at all?
No. It was a typical pre-election budget, and if I was sort of dictator of Australia, I would ban all pre-election budgets because the one in 2019, the one in 2022, and this one, they've all been pretty crap. No, it was a budget that didn't hurt anyone unless you were already still being hurt. And we'll get to, I know with the interview, sort of how if you're on JobSeeker, you just kept being hurt, but you weren't being hurt anymore. And if you were, this was one of the things we at the Australia Institute on Amy Ramikas's live blog, we actually did a bit of a winners and losers, but with actually a bit of intelligence. And we pointed out the winners were like gas companies, were rich people who were getting superannuation tax breaks, rich people who are getting, more than $12 billion from capital gains tax discounts. So the tax cut itself was fine. I don't mind that. I don't mind tax cuts where the biggest tax cut is going to someone on 45,000. I think that's quite good. Not huge, but to be honest, when you do combine it with the stage 3 changes, which means, back in 2022, they were paying 19% on income going up to 45, and by the end it'll be 14%. That's pretty sizable. But other than that, it was we've got nothing else, and it was a bit it was a bit of a meh budget.
Bit of a meh budget because they didn't expect to do it. Nicki, you were a bit critical in the lead into the budget of some of the measures which had been pre-announced, particularly these sort of cost of living sugar hits as they're described, in particular the energy rebate, which is unmeans tested and which is just sort of going out to give everybody a couple of $100 so that they can say they're doing something.
Yeah, so some of the measures they've introduced over the last couple of years, lowering PBS, lowering childcare costs, those things are really good because they not only help to bring down inflation in a period of high inflation, but they're actually, certainly with the childcare, enhancing for productivity and participation, which of course are the foundations of economic growth. But doing things like, just handing out money to people, and of course the opposition are doing exactly the same thing, except theirs is not only just throwing money away, but let's throw money and add a whole heap of emissions with it. And that's the thing with energy. We want to encourage people to be energy efficient. So, and in fact, about 2 years ago, maybe now, just as before Matt Keane was booted out, he actually introduced in New South Wales something called the Bill Busters, and they said to people, if you give us back your energy vouchers, we'll give you energy efficiency vouchers. And it's the teach a man to fish argument, or woman. You want to give people something that's going to last, not just handouts. But of course, it's an election, and compared to the last the 2022 election, where there was just so much largesse, it was ridiculous. It was an absolute, not just a sugar hit, it was a complete sugar coma. I think this was kind of reasonable. It wasn't, as Greg said, it's not a bad budget, but it's not a good budget. It was just, I sat there in the lockup just going, I don't know what to say about this. I'm bored already. There's nothing here, everything was small. There was nothing really for business. I do love the non-compete, which E61 was wrote about, 2 years ago now. So I think that's good. But, and I think the licensing stuff for why just Sparkies? Why not for everything? So, and that was the characteristic of this. It's just a teeny bit of this and a teeny bit of that. No big vision, no whatever, and a few stupid things like the energy rebates, but you can understand why ahead of an election they're not going to do it. So as far as election budgets go, I don't think it was as bad as it could have been, but
with the election lockup, with the budget lockup rather, given that it was so small, if you get really bored, are you allowed to leave?
That's a good
And
question.
then that you have to stay the whole time. It's not like if you leave the theatre and you're not allowed back in. You are there.
Your phone is confiscated. You're locked in a room. It's pretty.
Bring magazines and like colouring books. Or like
Yeah, I mean the new lockup now since COVID is all the press gallery. You're just in your press gallery bureaus, so you're all in your offices. So
I see.
And to be honest, even though it is boring, there's always stuff to do.
There's always something you can do.
There's always more to write, or you can start writing your sort of next day piece. I started writing my Centre for Future Work analysis piece, which is a bit sort of deeper and longer. But yeah, it was. I mean, actually, the worst one was last year, because last year, just as the lockup went, they announced pretty much the big thing, which was the energy rebate, and there was literally nothing else new. And we were like, why are we even here? They've already announced the big new thing. So yeah, they can be sort of fairly dry and dull affairs. Everyone shuffs off to go see Chalmers and Gallagher give their press conference. I didn't bother generally because they only like talking to the big names. It's good now at least we're not all having to go to the committee rooms and sit on awkwardly height desks on shitty chairs and everyone catches the flu because you had about 1,000 people all trapped in the same sort of rooms. It was a bit of a horror show.
Yeah. When you think about how these things have changed over the years, I've calculated this is my 38th budget.
Cool.
And my first budget was, you had to run down to the, I was working for a bank at the time, you had to run down to the Australian Government printing office in York Street and collect a physical copy of the budget and then read through. And there was a prize in the team for the first typo spotted. And but apart from the sort of logistics of it all, this was a time when Keating was, literally pulling a rabbit out of the hat and everyone going, oh my gosh, look what he's managed to do, and the big policy announcements. And I'm not suggesting that the budget should be that. In fact, I think there's a really good argument that we should be more like the British and the budget's just tabled, it's the accounts, do the policy stuff throughout the year so people have time to digest all of these things rather than having to go through hundreds or smaller amounts of pages to work out what you're actually doing and where things are buried. But yeah, it just is when you've been in that, compare those times with that great vision, those big, there really were surprises. Now you sort of go, meh. I might not make it to my 40th.
There's a nice comment from Rod in the comments that says he's sick of hearing treasurers refer to responsible budgets. You have to reframe some of this discussion, because how is giving gas companies these giant tax breaks a responsible budget? It might seem responsible if you're just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet, but there's so much more going on. Budgets are about the future of the country, what we want to have.
Well, this is to the point, Greg, that you made with the analysis that you did of the amount of revenue that the petroleum resource rent tax is actually bringing in, which, you know, Richard Dennis, who's a friend of the show, he had said we're getting more from HEX than we are from the petroleum resource rent tax. You actually did analysis that actually beer drinkers are contributing more to the consolidated revenue than that tax is at the moment.
Yeah, beer drinkers, spirits drinkers, I salute you. You're the real servants of the Australian economy. You're the backbone of the Australian economy, not the gas industry. And the classic with the beer drinkers is in the budget, they announced a pause on the indexation of beer. So they're kind of doing what they can to sort of limit the amount of beer excise. And still, they're going to raise nearly double the amount from beer excise that they do from the petroleum resources rent tax. And one of the great things about the PRT is every year they downgrade how much they think they're going to raise from it, and always the future years it's going down. It's quite astonishing that we're literally sort of in the midst and on the end of a gas boom that really sort of, because Russia invaded Ukraine, sent gas prices soaring, and we've literally got nothing from it. It's always good to remember that no LNG project, and we're, depending on the month, we're the biggest producer and exporter of LNG in the world, sort of competing with Qatar and the USA for number one. And not one LNG export project has paid a red cent of PRT. It's all coming from sort of Bass Strait, that type of stuff, the oil sector, nothing from LNG. And, that's pretty much looking set to continue. And we'll get to it, but, if Peter Dutton does get over the line, it's probably going to get even worse.
This just sounds very irresponsible.
Well, it is. Our line is always the budgets are about choices, and what the government tries to do is suggest that they're really limited in their choices, that, this is the amount of revenue there is, we couldn't do anything else to change it. And it's like, well, you could tax gas better, you could reduce all these tax breaks that are mostly going to the richest, the superannuation tax concessions, the richest 10%. Are getting around 20 billion a year, and notionally that's so that they can encourage them to save, so they won't be a burden on the government by taking out the age pension. Well, I'm sorry, but if you're in the richest 10%, you are never going to be on the age pension. So we're basically encourage them to save so that they can avoid paying tax. That's pretty much it. We got the fuel tax credit, that's 10 billion a year. Half of that goes to the mining companies. Mining companies, I don't need to tell you, are not struggling, but we decide they need $5 billion help, for which, to be honest, is a marginal bit of their profit, and yet we decide, that's fine. I mean, $5 billion, that's kind of raising JobSeeker $200 a fortnight, and yet we choose to pretend that we couldn't afford that because these other things are set in stone. So it's a really it's very much every year everyone gets up and lies about being responsible and being living within their means. They limit those means purposefully. One of the probably only good thing about this is the Oz and a few others tried to make it, but no one really seemed to get too sort of concerned about the size of the deficit this year. Everyone, which is a good thing, because who cares? The UK doesn't really care. The US pretend they do, but no one does. Australia is uniquely concerned about deficits, and hopefully we can sort of. I keep trying every year to kick it into the long grass, but it keeps coming back.
It's coming back.
Is that just about?
I probably disagree with you on that one, Greg, because I think whilst we're in the best position that we could be, I mean, Australia's net debt to GDP is so is so low. When you think the global average is nearly 100% and we're less than 30, I mean, it's not a problem. But what bothers me is that ever since 2002 and the first intergenerational report, we keep saying there's a problem and it's over there. And it's like climate change. It's over there. Let's just not worry about it for the moment, because it's politically hard if we have to make a few millionaires cry about not getting consent. I mean, the fact they can't pass the stopping concessions for people over 3 million in super is ludicrous. But all of this stuff is, you can't, if you look at the structural budget deficit, it's like, it's 1% or 1.5% of GDP. So, and then the next year, and then the next year, and the next year. And it's those cumulative deficits. If you've got no plan ever to change that, and all of the components of spending are just going up, and who knows what's going to happen to defence, but certainly ageing, NDIS, all those things are rising rapidly, even if not as fast as they were before. We can't just keep doing. Well, maybe we can. Maybe you're right, Greg. Maybe we can get to 200%. Look at the Japanese, and they haven't fallen over either. But is that wise? I wonder. Not to ever think about balancing it.
I mean, I'm certainly not sort of saying we can go MMT and it doesn't matter. But I'm just sort of suggesting, in the past, this would have been, you've blown the budget and everything. I think there's becoming a bit more, at least understanding that we're not about to go broke. But you're right. I mean, the problem with those intergenerational reports is Peter Costello basically did them to try and pretend we need to cut spending rather than actually we need to raise more revenue. And certainly that's why at the Oz Institute we always have a revenue summit, because it's like, let's raise some more revenue. We are such a low taxing nation. The calculations we've done is that even if we just got up to the average of all the advanced countries and how much tax we raise, countries, sort of socialist countries like Japan and or even New Zealand or Canada, would be looking at about an extra 135, 140 billion a year. And yet we just refuse to do it. And as Nicki's pointing out, the people that means we're not touching are gas, the richest, wealth taxes, they're just being avoided. That $3 million superannuation, which just seems to have been quietly dumped, is just astonishing when you can't affect something you can't do something that's only going to affect 80,000 people. And it's viewed as, that's too tough. It's a pretty dire state of affairs.
Well, I mean, I think you could do it clearly, and it's as you say, it's a choice which is not being made.
I think Bill Shorten got everyone scared. He tried to do a whole load of these things, got lumped, and Labor's just certainly just going, we're not going to take anything. And even before then, with the PRRT, when they wanted to implement that under Rudd Gillard, the mining industry just came in and such a strong voice. It's the politics of it is quite. I do get that it's tricky, but unless we have this intelligent conversation with the Australian public to say, we want to spend this amount, we've got to raise this amount of revenue. That you can't have, but everyone's too chicken.
Yeah, I understand it's politically difficult to tax the miners in the big end of town, and I mean, when we tried to tax the miners and they just ran up this campaign that it's going to affect all your superannuations, you're all going to, and they basically campaigned against the government. That's not a reason not to do this stuff. That's a reason to do this stuff better and more effectively and communicate clearly, because we're not playing a game. This stuff is real. It matters.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the thing with the 2019 election is basically the winners have told the history of that. And the winners were the people who didn't want there to be any changes to capital gains tax or any changes to anything. And they pretty much told the story that Shorten lost because of that. I doubt it. I think Shorten lost because there were things with the campaign that were a bit erratic, and Shorten kind of came under a lot of pressure himself. But basically, they had much the same result as in 2016, when he had the same sort of campaign to limit negative gearing. And the crucial thing is that 2019, actually, they did well in seats in the inner city, Melbourne and Sydney, that from electorates that actually would have been hurt most by things like changes to capital gains tax and the dividend credits. And those seats in 2022 became till seats. And so it's a case of, we all like to pretend that they lost because of the campaign against Shorten and all these sort of so-called death tax. I think it was more about expectations. Everyone expected Shorten to win. He didn't lose much worse than he lost in 2016. It's just that, you know, the expectations in 2016 weren't that he'd win. And certainly we saw this with the stage 3 tax cuts, that we certainly were pushing very hard to be changed. And the key thing that we were pushing was all our polling showing all the electorates where the people who would get hurt most by getting rid of the terrible old stage 3 actually looked at the stage 3 and were like, this is terrible. Why are you giving us this massive big tax cut? Do something better with it. And, you know, and also, you know, like even Labor this term, the one area they've been really bold is IR. They did things like bring in the ability for multiple enterprise bargaining, which prior to that everyone thought, oh no, that's going to get destroyed by the Oz, calling it pattern bargaining and everything. They actually got it through. They did it. So if you choose to make something your priority, if you choose to really go out hard, you can do it. It's just that there have been a lot of choices not to.
One thing that they won't choose to do, and I think this is because they are sitting so well in the polling in WA at the moment, is tackle the implications of Morrison's GST deal with WA, which is now costing the budget something like 17 times what it was projected to do so. And it is really an egregious example of a political fix, which is now coming back to bite us, but no one will tackle that question.
But you listen to the West Australians. I mean, Saul Eslake, my friend and colleague, is, you know, this is his bandwagon particularly. And oh my gosh, some of the comments, you know, particularly on things like LinkedIn, but more broadly, every time he raises this issue, you know, the West Australians go, oh, but we're regional, and oh, but you guys get everything good, and you know, oh, but when things turn down, we don't get enough. And it's like, well, actually, yes, you do. It's just this whole them versus us. I mean, you know, go and secede if you really want to, and then see how well you do in the bad years.
Well, one thing that WA does have is a gas reservation, and we on the East Coast often look over that with envy, coveting such you know, an allocation for the domestic market that WA was able to lock in. And Dutton, in his reply speech, he did raise this as a prospect for the East Coast, but only by expanding gas extraction, thus exacerbating impacts of climate change. But it is quite a good sleight of hand in some ways going into the election campaign, do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, the one good thing about the reservation policy, and I do have a few issues with it, and we should also note that over in WA, they've actually had to do some reviews into their DOM gas, as it's called, program, which has been utterly rorted by the gas industry, not giving them as much gas as they should. And because basically gas companies are, I think, gas companies are the worst companies in Australia. I have no doubt in saying that. They don't pay tax, they piggyback off of miners and everything. But the one good thing about Dutton's policy is acknowledging that we have stonks of gas. You know, we don't actually need to produce any more gas. We could have a reservation policy and we'd still have masses of gas left over to send it off to Japan or Korea so that they could then export it elsewhere, because they don't even need that much gas. It's a, you know, the problem with the reservation policy is that the amount that Peter Dutton is suggesting would still have gas companies making stocks of profits even off Australian consumers. The other problem is, of course, it continues to sort of incentivize gas use rather than moving to renewables. But really, I think one of the good things about it is that it has kind of got through a little bit to the rest of the media and places, realizing that, yeah, we export 80% of our gas. We should be able to keep some of that. There should be a cap. The only problem is, in his speech, you know, pretty much he went straight from talking about, you know, I'm going to to drive down the wholesale domestic gas price. He says, and that's just the start. And then the next line is, we'll fast track a decision on Western Australia's Northwest Shelf project, which I got to tell you, none of that gas, not one drop, is going to go anywhere in Australia. It's all export. So he's trying to say we don't need more gas, and yet we also need to have more gas projects for export. It's pretty illogical. So really the pressure should be on him to square that circle, but also really highlight the fact we should be capping sort of our exports. If you're sending 80% over, that's basically every year we're sending 4 years worth of domestic gas overseas. The reason why the gas companies are whining at the moment, even though he's promising more gas, is that gas companies are the worst companies in Australia. They don't like paying anything.
The media companies are pretty bad.
They're not going to pay any royalties on that. They'll get it for free. They won't pay any LNG because, as I said, LNG export projects never pay PRT. And they don't actually view the gas that is export, they don't view that as domestic gas. I was once, a couple of years ago, I was on a Senate committee hearing into this, and the head of APIA, or whatever it's called now, the gas company lobby group, basically said, well, she literally said, if it wasn't for the export markets, we wouldn't have extracted that gas. And it's like they just really hate. The one thing they hate more than paying tax or paying royalties is actually having to sell gas to Australians. So it's a good debate. I have issues with reservation policies, but at least we're being a bit more honest about how much gas we've got.
I read yesterday that the vast bulk of gas that we sell to Japan, they just resell on because they get it so cheaply from us that they just sell as a profit and don't use it.
That's why they keep putting pressure on us to keep it going out the door. They're making money out of it.
Well, instead of fixing that, let's just tax beer.
Yeah.
and charge for education. Look, we're going to go to a couple of interviews that I did on Friday, actually. First with Rick Morton, who was talking about the government's ongoing efforts to rein in the burgeoning cost of the NDIS and the implications of that. And also the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Services, Cassandra Goldie, about the budget's neglect of some of our most vulnerable Australians. So let's have a look at that. Rick Morton, thank you for joining us on the Sunday Josh.
Thank you for having me, Jo.
Exciting Sunday. The election has been called and we've just come out of a budget week. Now, the NDIS is, I think I'm right in saying, the third biggest item now in the budget behind the pension and defence. And this budget, they have very clear targets. It's a demand-driven program, notionally uncapped, but there are very clear targets now of the levels of growth that the government has deemed to be sustainable at about 8%, pulling it back from 20% as it was projected to grow in previous years. There's a lot of talk about cracking down on waste and fraud, but is that really where the savings are going to come from with the NDIS?
That's a very good question, Jo. And I'm much more interested in how they're going about doing this rather than the what. I don't think most people disagree with the fact that the NDIS can't grow at 20% every year. They talk about fraud. Fraud is minuscule compared to what they really mean when they talk about fraud, which is non-compliant payments. So providers and, what they view as providers and participants claiming for things that they shouldn't be claiming for that are not fraud, but are things that the NDIS does not want to pay for. Right. Now, that changes the status quo of what people have been able to do since 2013 when this scheme began. And they don't necessarily want to have that conversation with participants. They just want to say, we're no longer doing this. And so there's a lot more money. There's $17 million more in the budget for the non-compliant payments team. And there's new rules now that the CEO can tell people what they can and can't spend their money on.
One of the cohorts where there's very close scrutiny now is around kids, which are a really big and sort of unexpectedly big cohort of recipients of NDIS, aren't they? Many more children under the age of 15 are receiving NDIS payments, albeit modest packages, relatively speaking, than were originally projected.
Relative to the rest of the scheme, absolutely. And the thing is, this is the global phenomenon. There are, there's been a rise in kids with ADHD, with autism, neurodivergence. and what have you all around the world. The agency didn't get the numbers right. None of the modelling was right when this thing was first started, and that's not the fault of participants. That's the fault of planning and government. Now, what they're doing to get around that is to essentially kick kids off the scheme. The eligibility reassessments scandal was, sort of unfolding at the end of last year, where they were deciding we're going to change our policy and we're just going to give people 28 days to tell us, maybe we've got some evidence that says you're no longer eligible, but we're not going to tell you what that is. You have to go and guess what we think as an agency, find some evidence that you think will convince us otherwise. Again, we're not going to tell you what we know. And then come back and maybe, if you're lucky, we'll let you stay in the scheme. And if not, you're gone. Now, those kids have to go somewhere because it's not like they have their disability magicked away, but that somewhere does not yet exist. So the one thing that we did see in the budget is another $360 million over 5 years for what they call information linkages and capacity building. They love an acronym. I know. I don't want to get too messy on you. ILC, which is what that is, has been around since 2015, and it's what they decided to rename what used to be known as Tier 2 when the Productivity Commission designed the NDIS. Now, Tier 2 was meant to be what we now know as foundational supports,
right? Yep.
Which is this thing that does not yet exist in full, which has been promised as hey, you might not be on the NDIS anymore, but we're going to give you, moderate to low level supports in the community, in mainstream settings that, for someone who doesn't need an individual funding package for the NDIS, you will still have some support for your disability, which, by the way, evaporated when the agreements were signed for the NDIS. So we've now got this incredibly circular come back to the start moment where foundational supports are hinted at again in the budget. They're meant to start in June. There is no agreement between the states and the territories and the Commonwealth. We're about to go to an election. There's no money for that, but there is existing ongoing money for the ISL, which has been funded anyway since 2015, which is literally, it's not bad stuff, but it's a phone call to tell you where you might be able to get some community setting support. It's some capacity building for a local childcare centre to help them be more inclusive. None of it's bad, but the idea that you can link people to things that are not fully in existence yet is absurd, and which is one of the key criticisms we've had all the way through, which is that the big reform to the NDIS, it's saving, more than $14.4 billion now. They've managed to shave off the cost of this thing over the next decade, over the next 5 years, I should say. All of that has been happening before the furniture has been arranged in the room correctly.
What are the implications for particularly the kids who are kicked off then, if there is nothing to which they can go at this stage?
I think that's the most important point. Like, it's so easy to talk about budgets as a bunch of numbers and economics, and we can't have unsustainable growth with the NDIS. Like, I get all that, I get it, but the way they've been going about doing this has been abusive. I literally had an argument with people at the NDIS agency who tried to kill a story I was writing about the eligibility reassessments, because I said you can't give people 28 days, some of those days falling on Christmas in last year, to come up with evidence that you haven't told them they need and won't tell them what it is. You can't do that. And that's just one example. We've now seen other, people being caught out by telephone conversations that they think are just a quick chat, and they end up having their plans cut. There is a lot of cheeky stuff happening behind the scenes, and what you get is fear and stress. And in a community that has been fearful and stressed for so long about having access to the full quantum of their rights. You can't just force people to accept that your decision-making is perfect, because honestly, it never has been. It never has been. The fact that there isn't an acknowledgement of that feels a lot like they're being lied to by the government. And that is the most damaging thing of all, because this is a beautiful scheme. It is a wonderful thing. And right now it's hurting people, even as it's saving their lives.
How has it come to this, where we're talking about the dollars and cents only, as if the NDIS is a problem and a burden on the community and the economy, when actually it has been transformational in so many people's lives? And not just that, but according to per capita research as well, that for every dollar which is invested, the economy benefits by over $2. So it's,
and look, I mean, and that research is great, but I hate the idea that, community and social groups have to justify their existence in economic terms, which is the point you were making. But it's true. And also, even if you only take an economic lens, it's like, well, okay, but the Commonwealth budget in one portfolio, the NDIS, does not exist on its own. The NDIS that doesn't pay for one thing, health may have to pay for another at the federal level or at the state and territory level. Now, that becomes a bun fight between politics and officials who have their little line item. But that doesn't mean that you're saving money as a nation by kicking everyone off the NDIS. What it means is that you're actually maybe costing people more money by delaying interventions, delaying support when it's needed to get there, particularly for children, by not acting when you have information that needs to be acted. I've seen the letters that have been sent to people that say, look, we don't disagree that you've got your child has a severe and profound disability, but it's not one that the NDIS should sort out. That's a health concern arising from a health condition. And so it's not for us. Now, sure, okay, that's how countries in the West are set up. But it doesn't, change the lived reality of people on the ground that they have a kid who needs help. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we as a society save money or even manage to, deliver a better program by making these arcane, arbitrary decisions. Where we had the former Minister Bill Shorten act to reform the NDIS, he did so in the terms that he could, but it meant that he was acting on things that had, impacts for people now before the rest of it was sorted out. Make of that what you will. I don't know how else to describe that kind of sequencing issue other than by saying it's magical thinking.
There were more dollars for everybody except people with the least. And we were astounded that we would see another $7 billion in income tax cuts given priority off the back of $20 billion in income tax cuts that were delivered last year. And people on JobSeeker did not get anything in terms of action to fix the adequacy of the Australia's unemployment payment. And as many people know, if you care about the cost of living, if you want to end poverty in Australia, the number one thing you would do is fix the adequacy of our unemployment payment, JobSeeker and youth allowance. We will persist for the right reasons. Over 1 million people every day are relying on this payment. The cost of living crisis is not a crisis for everybody. Some people in Australia are doing extremely well, and we were astounded to see that in both of the budget and the budget reply that we would have measures that would help people right up the income scale with extra dollars, and not have action on the most important thing, which is supporting people's incomes who have the least.
So ACOS did some quite in-depth research on this last year about what it means for people on income support to continue to have to live in that kind of grinding poverty. Could you give us a brief insight into what life is like for people who are trying to survive on this really small payment?
Well, the research is grim. If you're on JobSeeker, you're 14 times more likely to be going without one substantial meal a day, in contrast to the rest of the population. And every day, people are speaking up about their personal experience. We had over 65 people directly affected by this grinding poverty speak to the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, and they repeatedly laid out how acute the distress is, the impact on mental health when you're constantly reprocessing what can I afford today and what can I afford to go without, what it's like to go into a shop and to have to continuously put things back, to be going, I can't afford to go to the doctor because I can't afford to do what they're going to ask me to do to look after my health. And this is happening in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So there is, in our view, no conscionable reason for us not to have action here. And I've been really encouraged again to see the number of politicians, including in the crossbench, who have come out very quickly to say it's a top priority for them. And I really hope, as we now in an election environment, that everybody will have a look in their electorate. If you're a candidate, make sure you look to see who really is in your electorate. In the 30 electorates that we've analysed, there are more people who would benefit from JobSeeker than the margin in that seat. And I have no doubt that the government, the political party that commits to fixing JobSeeker will get ahead, because people will see concretely, if you're elected, I will see my life change, and immediately, not in some far distant future. And people remember what it was like when the COVID period happened and those payments were increased, and how dramatically better their lives got in very modest ways. And it showed how easy it is actually to end poverty in Australia if we want to do it.
And it also showed the myths around, there would be no incentive for people to get work if you increased it, or they would spend it in frivolous ways. And, there was some very rigorous research done that just put the lie to all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, the Mandela research that was done for the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee this year looked at the economic benefits beyond the benefits to the individual. If you did fix JobSeeker, and they showed that in just the reduction in the pressure on the health system, because of course poverty makes you really unwell, and the additional productivity gains, because if you have economic security, you're much better able to invest in the skills retraining and turn up to the job interviews that you need to, that would produce an extra 24%. For every dollar that gets spent on the direct benefits of helping people feed themselves. So the research is very supportive and clear about this. And the OECD continuously calls out Australia's failure to deal with this really serious systemic issue, which means that we have persistent poverty, about, over 3 million people at any point in time, because of our inadequate social security system. We don't have a spending problem. Spending in Australia is not out of control. We're a very low public expenditure country amongst OECD equivalents. So we're the 6th lowest when it comes to our public expenditures. We've been under-investing in essential services and safety nets for decades. And that's why we've had a crisis in aged care, a crisis in childcare. We've got persistent poverty, and we've got people crowdfunding to try and get their teeth fixed. We have a revenue problem. We're the 9th lowest when it comes to our overall revenue base. And so we were strongly opposed to any further income tax cuts, not only because they're not the right priority right now in terms of providing cost of living help to people, but because they further weaken our tax base. We don't have any tax reform being supported by the major parties at the moment. In any substantial way, and we have to be prepared to strengthen our revenue base. There's a bundle of egregiously generous tax breaks, including in the area of superannuation and housing taxes, that you would absolutely tackle. We've got about 30 billion in tax breaks going to the top 10% in just those 2 areas per year. And then we get into areas like the fossil fuel rebate and other areas of taxation reform that we would strongly urge, because it's not only about raising the revenue, but if you get tax reform right, it changes behaviour. I mean, in housing taxes, yes, we would raise billions if we fixed negative gearing and the capital gains discount. But as importantly, if we change the rules on those taxes, it would change investment behaviour. We've got far too many property investors in the housing market chasing the sort of short-term capital growth. Buy and sell, hope the properties go up, and you'll make a gain on the way out with a discount. Instead, we should change the rules so that we're encouraging property investors to get in for the long term. Renting should be a decent option, and you should be able to get multi-year rental leases and have confidence that you're not going to get evicted at short notice and have to move your kids out of another public school. So the tax area is one where we will continue to have a voice in the context of this election, because we as a community need to find our voice on some of what is often seen as too hard, because you put in the too hard basket, and we continue to have people out there going, I can't understand why I can't get into a doctor or get my teeth fixed.
So there's clearly a level of frustration there coming from Cassandra and ACOS about the government's refusal to raise the rate. And, their own Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee that Cassandra references has recommended this happen before every budget of this government. And as you say, it's a choice which is being made. And if it's a choice that's being made by a Labor government, it feels really hopeless in some ways, as how will this ever change? Greg, you've talked about that the tax cuts that you're quite supportive of announced in the budget will cost 7.7 billion by 28/9. And that is about 50% more than it would have cost to raise the rate and to have increased JobSeeker to $200 by $200 a fortnight.
Yeah, and when I say I'm supportive of the tax cuts, if you're going to do tax cuts, I'm supportive of those.
Yeah.
But I would have much preferred them to have raised JobSeeker, and as both Nicki and I pointed out, you could do both if you actually removed a heck of a lot of these tax concessions and tax breaks. We would have $40 billion to sort of play with and actually do some good things. And it really is an area that needs focus. It's something I'm not certainly we're the Oz Institute and not putting up the white flag yet. We're really pushing for it. And look, everyone is kind of the view that there's going to be a minority government.
Yeah.
And while I don't agree with all of the things that the Teals have been suggesting on tax, they do at least are aware of it and aware of the need to reform it. Dave Pocock's been very strong in it. Zali Steggall, Allegra Spender as well, very much. So I think there is an ability to do these things, and I think it's just you got to sell it properly. You can't just talk about we're going to remove all these taxes and then say and we'll use that to pay off debt. Everyone's going, well, I don't give a damn about that.
Yeah.
But if we're able to put it as we'll raise JobSeeker, we're going to increase spending on education, on public schools by 20%. We can increase spending on, whatever, that actually sells it in a way of, actually, that's a better use of money than giving $20 billion to the richest 10% for no good reason. You got to actually have that desire to sell it. And, everyone thinks that something's impossible until it's done. Literally a week before the government changed stage 3, everyone said they can't do it. It'll be political death. They did it. It was popular as all hell. Unfortunately, they didn't take that as a cue of people like you doing good things. Do more of it. They decided not to. I think the need is there. We're just going to have to, as a voting public, push for it.
Yeah, when you think about what we did during COVID, it was suddenly like, you're real unemployed people.
Yes.
You're not, just dodgers, dole bludgers, whatever. And until we change that language, I mean, we've got, 4% unemployment. If you don't have a job in this country, it's not for want of trying. There is structural unemployment. There are people there, and a lot of people in Cassandra Goldie's cohort who, they haven't got their teeth fixed. I can remember doing work with Vinnie's and this case study, the story came up, this guy, and they helped him get his teeth fixed. And that was the thing that was holding him back. And then he actually went and got a job, being able to catch a bus to get a job interview.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just nuts, this attitude that we have, but it's not a vote winner. And I'm surprised, even amongst my sort of cohort of friends who are socially enlightened, people aren't sitting around going, isn't it terrible? Isn't it terrible about climate change? Isn't that terrible? But nobody says, isn't it terrible about JobSeeker? And maybe there's just too much disconnect from the middle classes to those that are genuinely on struggle street. I don't know.
There does seem to be a big detachment here, and I'm not an economist like you two. I guess I'm better at analyzing political narratives, but given what I'm hearing from all of this and the Labor Party's claim to not want to leave anybody behind, I am not seeing evidence mesh with that conclusion. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, we also have to remember that we've got a Reserve Bank that actually believes we need 4.5% of the labour force unemployed to keep inflation down. So when you also tie that with the fact if you're unemployed, you're probably about 36% below the poverty line, that means that the Reserve Bank's, and to be honest, the government's view is that we need that many people living in poverty so the rest of us can have nice, stable inflation. I mean, it's a pretty cruel state of affairs. And, that's why I agree people aren't out there thinking that this is a terrible thing, other than, hopefully everyone watching today. But that's why if you make it as part of a suite of things that, you don't just do something to raise job seeker, you do it for other things. But I really agree with what Nicki said and what Cassandra was saying about during COVID. I mean, COVID showed one, if you give poor people more money, they're no longer in poverty. It actually works. It's not all that complicated. And also that the public service is pretty essential. And there's a lot of need and desire for the government to do things. Well, let's fund it. Let's do those things. And I think people will go, actually, that's pretty good. And if someone comes along and says, actually, I'm going to cut all this, people are not going to want that to happen, I think.
So we are entering into an interesting week. So this is the first full week of the election campaign, and in lots of ways, the economy is in quite good shape. I mean, low unemployment to the extent it is, got a 4 in front of it these days. Inflation does seem somewhat stabilised. As in the budget, showed that there was some welcome real wage growth happening, often a lot as a result of the government's intervention. Interest rates coming down, it seems, although, Nicki, this week the Reserve Bank is meeting on Tuesday. So do we have any rumblings as to what might happen in that meeting and then that will inevitably play out throughout the election campaign this week?
So I don't think it's a lay down misère that they won't cut rates, but I don't think any economist, myself included, is forecasting that they will. But the reason they might have more than a perfunctory debate about it is because we just had the last week the February Consumer Price Index, which was slightly below expectations, and we have now consistently seen inflation for probably 6 months and wages coming in below where the Reserve Bank was expecting it to be. And so if they don't go in April, which, okay, they might wait for the March quarter number, I can see why they want to do that, but there's no reason for them not to cut. So it's just a question of when, not if. You say the economy is in fairly good shape. We've still got per capita spending is, is going backwards. The per capita GDP was up by 0.1%. Yippee! But at least it was positive, I guess, in the December quarter. So, people are still struggling. You just go to any shopping centre and there are sales everywhere. We know from the budget that they felt the need to help the hospitality sector. So there's, the percentage of businesses going under has jumped up again, very high, almost 1 in 10. Where the economy's not slipping towards recession, but nor is it galloping away, or even in a place where I'd say I feel comfortable with it. This is not an economy where you'd say people's living standards are looking, the future is looking rosy, and we've got all these threats on the horizon with Liberation Day and other things going in the geopolitical as well as geoeconomic circumstances, and you go, if I'm worrying about the risks to the economy, they are very heavily skewed to the downside now. For a long time, the RBA was saying, well, they're a little bit this, we're more worried about the upside risks than the downside. You just can't keep saying that anymore, I don't think. So don't expect something this week. I know Prime Minister would love it, but I don't think we'll get one this week. But I do think there's a very strong argument for May.
Well, and we do, of course, have Liberation Day hurtling towards us this week, which is the day that apparently the tariffs are due to come into effect, but who knows what may happen between now and April the 2nd with Trump. This is the sort of the big elephant in the room throughout this whole election campaign. I think that unlike what is now happening strongly in Canada under Mark Carney, with their elections going to be 1 week before ours on April 28, and indeed Europe with Macron, Starmer, where they are now acknowledging publicly and strongly that America is a malign influence on the world and is no longer a reliable ally, and they are taking strong steps to address that fact. We here in Australia, we're not doing that yet, Greg.
Yeah, no, and it's pretty pathetic, to be honest. I mean, a classic example of this was this week in Question Time. I forget who asked it. It might have been Adam Bant. Was asked about AUKUS and also the fact that given, Trump is being a malign influence, why are we still going for it? And Albanese gave a very, we're sticking with AUKUS, it's the safest way. And rather unusually, Peter Dutton sought permission to get up and support the Prime Minister's response on that, to make it clear that they're with AUKUS as well. AUKUS is a great thing. It's just truly incredible, and I think there really needs to start being some questions given to both leaders about, okay, let's just pick Ukraine, where it's pretty clear the European Union and UK are looking at sort of building up a coalition of forces that will go in as effective peacekeepers. You know, if America says no, would we say yes? Would we actually go against our Lord and Savior America, or are we going to actually show that we're a nation that actually has some sovereignty? It's something we really got to do, aside from the fact that we keep giving money to AUKUS, which we're not going to get anything for. Everyone seems to think that's a good plan. I remain to be convinced.
There's a little bit of Neville Chamberlain about Albanese at the moment.
Yeah, it's just, you know, there's such I mean, and it's why, you know, and this is one of the things about the tariffs and everything. The only time we've seen the Labor government or anyone sort of step up and try and sort of shirt front Trump in any sort of way is on the PBS, because they knew that was politically safe. But as soon as it gets anywhere else, oh no, you know, America's our great friend. Well, America's not a great friend to anybody at the moment. And we've got to wake up to that, because if we don't, and there was really nothing in the budget, no sort of sense of we need more spending on diplomacy and beef up our diplomatic missions around the world. You know, what did we do on foreign aid? There was no response to the ending of US aid. We should have seen that as an opportunity to make sure that we can sort of lift the help those people and also get in that soft power. There was none of that. You know, there are all these opportunities, and we're just sort of hoping that actually the old world is still existing, and it ain't.
Because you sure as hell thinking that China will be looking at the demise of US aid as an opportunity to bring in more of their soft power not just in our region, but actually through Africa and around the world. Dave.
Trump forgot what AUKUS was a few months ago, and then afterwards explicitly said, well, we're not going to give anyone our best stuff because maybe they won't be our allies in the future. Just to go back to my point about being a responsible government would listen to those words and act on them, rather than just keep funneling mafia protection money to an authoritarian state.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've got a USA free trade agreement and only one side is agreeing to it. And all the things that we signed away to get America to give us some lower tariffs on beef, like all the intellectual property rights, all the copyright changes that we did, they didn't benefit us, they benefited Disney and American companies. And yet we're like, oh no, we still got to honor this commitment, while Donald Trump is, let's be honest, using it as toilet paper. So it's just weird. We do have some agency, we do have some leverage. If we were about to say, hey, you know how we increased our copyright to 70 years, we're going to go back to that 50 year. There would be a lot of companies in America squealing, and we could say, well, what are you doing about our tariffs? We got to use some of the stuff that we got. At the moment, we're like, oh no.
Which is exactly what Mark Carney was saying. He's saying, you know, we have agency in this, and we are going to use it. And if Canada can, who was
and also I think if Albanese did it, it'd be very politically popular. I mean, come on,
agree.
Step up to Trump.
I don't think there are political risks in standing to Trump. I think this is another one of those many issues where the Australian people are ahead of the two major parties, and it feeds into that frustration with the duopoly, which I think we will continue to see play out over this campaign. I mean, one thing that also wasn't in the budget, which a friend of the show, Ketan Joshi, wrote about was, you know, even as they were only delivering the budget because of the impact of ex-Cyclone Alfred and the impacts of climate change, there was really very little in the budget that actually addressed that fundamental problem. So the two biggest issues really, climate change and the role of America in the world today, were really not addressed by the budget, and hopefully they will be over the course of the campaign, which we now have for the next 5 weeks. It's going to be interesting times. We're coming towards the end of our show. I will just do our little YouTuber thing, please do like and subscribe to us. I feel like such a cliche saying that, but it does keep the algorithm gods happy, and it will deliver our show to more people. You'll also have the opportunity at the end of the show, there'll be a little QR code if you'd like to throw in a few dollars. That will ensure we can stay on for the duration of this election campaign, and who knows, there you go, maybe even after. Before we finish, we know it's going to be an interesting, if not tumultuous, few weeks. Any last top tips you would like to give about what we might see or what you'll be looking out for in the next 5 weeks, Nicki?
Well, I'm obviously, with my Climate Council hat on, looking for more for climate, because as you said, the budget was a big disappointment. There was some money moved from one pot to another, but nothing significant. Nothing, we need to do more on mitigation. We need to stop, the support of subsidies to fossil fuel companies. But we also need to, that's very hard for the government. I see that. It shouldn't be, but it is. But if that's not where you're going, then let's just the capacity investment scheme, more options, more for ARENA. Let's make sure every agency possible is delivering everything possible to get renewables out there. We're already at 40%. Not a lot of Australians realise how far we've already come. They're very tentative about it. We're getting there. We're fantastic with rooftop solar, get batteries in, just electrify the crap out of everything. And let's see us mitigate and adapt and support households and businesses to get on that journey. Because if you think, what we've seen in the last 4 years with fires and floods and cyclones is bad, the less we do, the more of that stuff we're going to have. This should be a climate election.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing in the budget that was highlighted, I think, was that they had to put in another 1.2 billion to deal with the hole, as Chalmers said, that had been blown, the Cyclone Alfred-sized hole. But there was also another 11.6 billion for disaster support.
13.5 we're up to now.
Yeah. I mean, this is
crazy.
These are the real costs, so why not invest to try and ameliorate them? Greg, your top tip.
Well, look, I just agree with everything Nicki said there, and I kind of rather than looking forward, I want to kind of look back and remind everyone that really the most important thing that happened on budget day wasn't in the budget. It was the government ramming through changes to the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which basically is sentencing the Maugean skate to extinction. And we saw the extraordinary performance by Tanya Plibersek, perhaps not uncoincidentally in a salmon suit, delivering this actual line of this bill would remove the ability of the Minister for the Environment to reconsider a past decision on action that meets certain very specific criteria. I mean, the Minister of the Environment presenting a bill limiting the ability of the Minister of the Environment to protect the environment. I mean, it was a shameful act, all done purely because News Corp really been pushing it, making it sound like this is going to destroy the Tasmanian economy. We're talking 60 jobs here, 60. Yeah. And a couple of those aren't even in sort of the area they sort of drive in, drive out. The companies pay no tax, they're foreign owned. It's destroying the environment, literally, creating a whole lot of shit, basically, in Macquarie Harbour, literally. More shit than actually Tasmanians produce in sewage. A disgraceful thing, and it really bodes poorly for the campaign where as Nicki pointed out, we need so much more on environment, on climate change, and both sides are choosing really not to make that an issue, which just seems extraordinary given, pretty much the entire reason for the timing of this campaign is Cyclone Alfred, which is due to climate change. So that's certainly what we'll be pushing and trying to get more of over the next 5 weeks.
And I do think that that the major parties, and particularly the government, may have misjudged the salmon industry issue profoundly, and we're already seeing surges of support for the independent candidate for Franklin Peter George down there, who's actually quite well known as a former ABC Four Corners journalist anyway, and his polling is really jumping in the wake of the government's handling of this, because it is, as you say, it's 60 jobs. There's no tax coming from these multinational companies, and it's destroying the natural environment in Tasmania, which Tasmanians are very proud of. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that over the course of the campaign. Dave, for you, anything you'd like to finish with, or are you just going to rattle the tin for us a bit more?
No, two things. I spent an awful lot of time highlighting terrible, cowardly reporting in Australian media, and I was thinking, listening to your interview with Rick Morton, how grateful I am that he's on that particular beat and reporting with intelligence and empathy. There's not much of that in this country, and that's really, really good. And then the other thing I want to say quickly, this election campaign, there will be so much misinformation trying to get Australian voters to be terrified of voting outside of the party duopoly. I'm already seeing it on social media, and all I would say is understand our electoral system, understand preferential voting, and just really think deeply about why some of those myths are circulating before you buy into them.
Well, thank you to Greg and Nicki for joining us on this special post-budget special. We're very grateful for your expertise and for getting up early for us on Sunday morning. Thank you to all of our viewers. We look forward to seeing you next week. There'll be another week under our belt of this campaign, and we're going to have a focus on women and women's policy. We've got Miranda Priestley from Women's Agenda and Jess Hill joining us on the panel. So have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.